What I'm going to do now is discuss emotions, and to see how emotions are the way we label the subjective experience of the brain placing a priority on different general behavior types. For example, if we're experiencing the emotion of anger, we can view this as the brain placing a priority on aggressive type behaviors, making the selection of such behaviors more likely, although not certain. Placing a priority on a general type of behavior is itself a behavior, which must be recommended by receptive field detections and selected by the subcortical structures. For example, receptive fields detected in response to low blood sugar in the body can recommend food-seeking behavior. And these receptive fields and their association with food-seeking behaviors may be specified by genetic information, but learning could sometimes modify the associations. So, hunger is the subjective experience of a priority being placed on food-seeking behaviors. Receptive fields within current sensory inputs from the environment that correlate with the presence of some threat, but a threat within our ability to handle may recommend aggressive behaviors. Or, if the threat looks more than we can handle, the receptive field detections may recommend behavior types like hiding or running away. Receptive fields detected within sensory inputs from objects likely to pose a health risk, partly decayed food for example, may recommend rejection behaviors. And we can label these different priorities as different emotions. Receptive fields correlating with a very high degree of novelty in the environment may in some cases recommend delaying specific behavior selection and just recording lots of information. And we label this response as the emotion surprise. Receptive fields correlating with a major change in our social environment, such as loss of a close friend by permanent departure or death, may recommend avoiding social behaviors for a significant period of time because the social environment has become uncertain. And we label this response as sadness. If our recent behavior selections have generally resulted in positive reward feedback, receptive fields detected within those circumstances may recommend selections of similar behaviors in the immediate future, and we label this response happiness. So, how can these prioritization behaviors be understood at a somewhat more detailed anatomical level? Well, there's two major ways in which a priority could be implemented: a cortical route and a subcortical route. The brain can increase the probability that receptive fields recommending behaviors of the selected type are detected. For example, if the thresholds of the cortical neurons that recommend aggressive behaviors are reduced, they'll detect their receptive field in response to fewer inputs. So they'll be more likely to detect their receptive fields, and in general, more detections with aggressive behavior recommendation strengths will occur. Another way is to increase the probability that behaviors of the selected type are selected. For example, by reducing the thresholds of the striatal neurons corresponding with those behavior types, resulting in stronger outputs from those neurons and a greater probability of being selected. For the cortical route, we have the columns organized into areas, and prioritization could reduce the receptive field detection thresholds across an area, or target regions within different areas, or even target individual columns that on balance tend to recommend the selected behavior types more strongly. A problem with all this is that it requires that some identifiable cortical receptive fields tend to recommend some behaviors more than others, which means that these receptive fields are not fully shared across behaviors. This has some implications for resource economy, because if there's a bit less sharing of receptive fields across behaviors, then more receptive field resources will probably be required. And I'll come back to that point a little later. The structures that implement the priorities into the cortex are the hypothalamus and the amygdala. And if you recall, the hypothalamus targets diffusely across the cortex and can therefore target broad areas or regions of the cortex. Targeting by the amygdala is much more specific and could therefore influence even individual columns and neurons. The hypothalamus tends to reduce the thresholds of neurons across some region, while the amygdala provides a few additional glutamatergic inputs into selected neuron targets. In addition, the amygdala modulates the activity of the hypothalamus. On the subcortical side, components do correspond with behaviors, and there could be components corresponding with the selection of general types of behavior, and components corresponding with more specific behaviors that are of a general type. So both these types of components could be targeted to increase their selection probabilities. In this case, it's the amygdala that targets the basal ganglia components. But the hypothalamus can influence the process through its targeting of the amygdala. We talked earlier in the course about how the amygdala and the hypothalamus implement all this at a somewhat more detailed anatomical level. So the amygdala and hypothalamus target both the cortex and the basal ganglia to regulate the relative probabilities of different types of behavior. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's an issue with implementing prioritization of different types of behavior, because it has to be possible to identify cortical and basal ganglia resources corresponding predominantly with each type. But recall that the need to limit resources means that, for example, the receptive field of a cortical column needs to be able to recommend a wide range of different behaviors. So at the most resource efficient, one receptive field will have recommendation weights in favor of lots of different types of behaviors. But to make prioritization efficient, it's better to have receptive fields that predominantly recommend one type of behavior, which reduces the sharing of receptive fields across multiple behaviors, and will therefore tend to need more receptive field definition resources. So the brain will have to find a compromise, where the behavioral value of being able to prioritize between different types of behavior exceeds the biological cost of duplicating resources. So you can expect to see a limited range of general behavior types being managed for priority. In other words, a limited range of different emotions. And you also expect to see some cortical regions tending to specialize in different, very general behavior types. The existence of that kind of cortical specialization is suggested by the observation that major associative cortex brain damage sometimes generates shifts in personality, implying removal of some cortical resources reduces the probability of some general types of behavior. There's going to be genetic information going into the specification of emotions. For example, there could be some receptive fields that are specified genetically to a significant degree, receptive fields corresponding with low blood sugar, or corresponding with types of visual shapes that justify fear, like the general shapes of snakes or spiders. And genetic information could also specify connections between these receptive fields and the corresponding behavioral components. In the case of what are sometimes called primitive emotions, the degree of genetic specification could be high, although overlaid to some degree by experience. Basic emotions like anger, surprise, and so on will also have a significant degree of genetic specification, as illustrated by the observation that there are facial expressions associated with these emotions, and these facial expressions are the same across different cultures. Someone brought up in Papua New Guinea can recognize the expression in a photo of an angry Australian, implying that these expressions and corresponding emotions are genetically specified rather than learned. However, there will still be a considerable degree of learning in defining the circumstances in which these emotions are invoked and the typical behaviors that result. The degree of learning involved in emotions sometimes labeled social or moral will be even higher, although some genetic specification could still be present. Now note that this makes it possible to heuristically define new emotions. For example, the amygdala could define and detect receptive fields that correspond with circumstances in which a new general type of behavior is appropriate, and target cortical receptive fields that tend to recommend behaviors of that type. Finally, I'd like to comment on a couple of higher cognitive aspects of emotion. If this represents the different cortical areas, we can view the amygdala to some degree as a kind of additional area. It's got the same type of neurons and similar reciprocal connectivity with other cortical areas and with the thalamus. Now, suppose this represents an angry brain. Receptive fields in lots of areas are active, and also receptive fields in the amygdala that recommend aggressive behaviors. Then suppose that this brain often hears the word angry during such episodes. Auditory receptive fields at a complexity able to discriminate between words will often be active, and they will therefore often be active at the same time as amygdala receptive fields that recommend aggressive behaviors. Maybe also receptive fields in the frontal cortex will be active that also tend to recommend aggressive type behaviors. Because of this frequent simultaneous activity, the auditory columns will acquire recommendation strengths in favor of indirect activation of the amygdala and frontal cortex receptive fields that are often active when the brain is angry. But these are some of the receptive fields that have recommendation strengths in favor of being angry. Hence, hearing the word could, to some degree, create the emotion. Lastly, the brain activity during an experience in which the person becomes angry is illustrated. Visual columns detect their receptive fields, and there are detections in a number of parietal and frontal cortex areas. And because there's anger, receptive fields in the amygdala are active. As discussed earlier, there's a degree of novelty in most experiences, and there's therefore receptive field expansion, perhaps even including the amygdala. So, since the hippocampal system records groups of neurons active when receptive field expansions were occurring, the activity of a significant part of this population can be reconstructed later, including the activity in the amygdala. So the recall of the experience will tend to result in activation of amygdala receptive fields recommending aggressive behaviors. In other words, recall of some experiences will result in feeling angry. So, an emotion is the subjective experience of a priority being placed on a general type of behavior. Placing such a priority is itself a behavior that must be recommended and selected by the brain. Some of the key receptive fields that recommend emotions are located in the amygdala, and the amygdala and hypothalamus implement priority selections. And because of speech-type capabilities, hearing the word for an emotion can trigger the emotion, and the memory for an emotional event can also trigger the emotion.